talk about today is reinforcement, because as we know, in working with kids with autism, it can be really tricky to find things that are reinforcing for them. Because they may have very idiosyncratic interests, they may just not appear to really be interested in anything at all. And as we know too, reinforcement is very important for learning. So I'm going to start kind of way back at the beginning of what is reinforcement, and then we'll get into the more complicated things of how do we find things that are meaningful and reinforcing for kids on the spectrum. So just very basically, what is reinforcement? Reinforcement is anything that increases the frequency of a behavior. So this can kind of catch some people up sometimes, that they think, well, reinforcing is something that makes kids do good things. And that is not always the case. That what we're looking here is just, does it increase the frequency of a behavior? So we'll talk later about accidental reinforcement, or maybe reinforcing behaviors that we don't want to reinforce, that we don't want to increase. So when I'm talking about reinforcement, just keep in mind that this is the broader definition that we're looking at. Repeated reinforcement leads to learning. So if we're looking at what behaviorism is when we reinforce a behavior and the child then increases the frequency of that behavior. So we continue repeating that until that response is then learned. That when this happens, then the child will be reinforced and they will eventually learn that this is the desired response. Positive versus negative reinforcement is the other concept that can kind of trip people up a little bit and can be a little bit tricky. So positive reinforcement increases the frequency of the behavior by adding something. So again, we're not thinking about positive and negative in terms of something good and something bad. We're thinking about it just in terms of, is it adding something in terms of it being positive or taking something away, which would be negative. So positive reinforcement increases the frequency of the behavior by adding something. So for an example, a kid gets time to play with Legos because they finished their homework. We added the opportunity to play with Legos, which means that the next time the child is going to be more likely to finish his homework so that he has the opportunity to play with Legos. Does that make sense? All right. So then negative reinforcement is when we increase the frequency of a behavior by taking something away. So a mother nags her child about cleaning her room, and then the child cleans her room without being asked because she doesn't want mom to nag her. So the reinforcement piece is we took away the nagging, so the child is going to increase the behavior of cleaning her room. Does that make sense? All right, awesome. I know it can be a little bit tricky. So what are reinforcers? Can anybody give me an example or just a broad definition of what a reinforcer would be? Don't bite, I promise.
Like food.
Food could be a very good reinforcer. All right, awesome. So, and food is kind of the one that everybody goes to, especially for younger kids on the spectrum, that is immediately reinforcing. So we're going to be definitely talking about food. But reinforcers are items, activities, or interactions that increase the likelihood that a behavior will occur. So it could be preferred items, it could be food, it could be a preferred activity. And I kind of grouped it into a couple different categories of tangible, edible, sensory, and social reinforcers. So we've got a lot of different examples here. That it could be a tangible reinforcer. It could be something like playing with cars, playing with Thomas the Tank Engine, playing with movies. It could be a really cool sensory toy that spins and lights up and makes noise and is all sorts of wonderful and awesome. It could be getting time to play on a Nintendo DS. It could be playing with dinosaurs or a push ball. Any of those things could be a tangible reinforcer that would make a child increase the frequency of a behavior if he has access to these toys. We could also have edible reinforcers. And when I say edible reinforcers, most people think I'm going to try to pump their kids full of candy or food dye or something terrible, but that's not always the case. Some kids, they are really reinforced by M&Ms and Skittles and chips and those types of things. I worked with a little guy for a long time whose absolute highest reinforcer was olives. So we would cut olives into 4 pieces and he would work his butt off to earn olives. That's not what I would work for, but for him that was just the most reinforcing thing. Pickles were another thing that he would work for. I worked with a little guy for a while whose most reinforcing thing was Slim Jims. As a vegetarian for a long time, cutting up Slim Jims was not my favorite activity, but he, again, would work really, really hard to earn those pieces of Slim Jims. So it's all about what the kid, again, is reinforced by what they like. There's also social reinforcers. Some kids may just be really motivated by saying, hey, good job, good work, you're a rock star, I'm so proud of you, nice working. Clapping your hands, tickling, thumbs up, high fives, lots of really high quality praise, which I'll define high quality praise in a little bit. And then we have escape and sensory needs that may be reinforcing for the child. So it could be that they sit and work with you for a period of time, and then they get to request a break, and that is highly reinforcing, no matter what they get to do during the break. They just get to have their own time, and they don't have to sit and talk with you or work with you, and that in itself is reinforcing, just the escape from work. I know I have a lot of kids that really like bouncing on the big exercise balls, so they're going to just hang out, jump on the ball, have that really nice needed sensory break during that time, and that will be very reinforcing. Jumping on the trampoline, going for a walk. I have a lot of kids that I work with in clinic that we sit and we work for a couple minutes, and then we walk or run up and down the hallway a couple times. Then we come back and sit down, and then we go and we run up and down the hallway. It's nice and distracting for everybody else that's still working, but it gets the kid to still work and be very motivated and reinforced to come back and continue working with me. All right, do you have any questions about those categories of reinforcers? Make sense? All right, awesome. So when I talk to parents about this, a lot of parents will look at me and say, okay, Dr. Lara, that's just great. Now I'm going to have a kid that's a spoiled brat that won't do anything for me unless I'm bribing them with pieces of candy or unless I'm giving them their DS every single time they touch their nose. And that's not necessarily the case, but I know that's where a lot of parents' minds go to. So we're going to talk about that again in just a minute and what's the difference between reinforcement and bribery. A lot of parents also say, well, I don't have the time or the money to be reinforcing my child this frequently. And that also just isn't true either. Reinforcement could be as simple as a high five. Hey, great job, give me a high five, that's awesome. Reinforcement could be as simple as, a piece of the candy. It could be, any of the number of things that we talked about before, even other things that we haven't even talked about that are reinforcing for the child. But it does not have to be time consuming, doesn't have to be costly. Parents will also say things like, well, reinforcement, that means I have to take him to Chuck E. Cheese every single time he does something good. I don't have the type of money to be taking him to Chuck E. Cheese all the time, and that's just not true either. So what's the difference between bribery and reinforcement? Bribery is typically offered after the child starts to engage in problem behavior. So if we look at this picture of this little guy, let's say that he was supposed to brush his teeth, he doesn't want to, mom says, come brush your teeth. He says, no, I'm not going to do it, I never brush my teeth, I'm never going to brush my teeth. Mom says, if you come brush your teeth, you'll get $10. He's then already engaged in problem behavior, so that then turns into bribery. Whereas if it was put in place as reinforcement ahead of time, and it was placed as, hey, if you brush your teeth, then you can have $10, since that's what's in the picture, although money isn't my favorite thing, then you're putting in place ahead of time. He knows what the stakes are, knows what he's getting himself into, and then you aren't kind of trying to wheedle your way in to gain compliance after the non-compliance has already happened. With bribery too, parents will tend to give the reward prior to the completion of the task. So they'll hand the $10 over before the child has actually come and brushed their teeth. Or they use it to kind of lure the child along the way of, hey, we're going to walk outside, you can have this, you can walk with me as long as you're holding your DS, and then they're kind of holding the DS and dragging the child along behind them. The child isn't really complying at that point. With reinforcement, the reward is given after the desired behavior. You walk to your car, then you get the DS. That's reinforcement, and you're again then increasing the likelihood that the child's going to be compliant with walking to the car, or is going to be compliant with brushing his teeth, rather than the child's going to increase the likelihood that he'll be non-compliant and be dragged to the car by his toy, which is not the behavior that we want to increase. Does that all make sense? All right, you guys can stop me at any time if you have questions or anything like that. So what reinforcement is? Reinforcement is motivation. It's a way of saying to the child, hey, look, if you do this for me, then you will be able to do this really fun thing afterwards. It's a way of increasing positive behaviors. It's short term. Parents tend to think that Reinforcement is going to be forever, that if they start out by reinforcing a child with Skittles, that every single time for the rest of his life, they're going to be needing to give him Skittles every time he puts his shoes on. And that's not true either. It's short term. Again, reinforcement leads to learning. So once the task is learned, then we don't need to continue with the reinforcement. Reinforcement is a positive behavioral intervention. It's a way of shaping appropriate behaviors, and we'll talk more about shaping in a little bit. It's a way of teaching appropriate behaviors, and it's necessary. Reinforcement is not bribery. We talked about the difference between reinforcement and bribery. It's not bartering. Some parents will kind of go into an interaction with their child indicating, you know, well, I'll give you this if you do this, and then the kid will try to up the ante and say, well, I won't do it for 2 Skittles, but I'll do it if you give me a bag of chips. And that's not what we're getting into here. You need to be in control of the situation when you go in, and that's the importance, again, of setting it up ahead of time so that there's very clear consequences and rewards. It's not a way of tricking a kid into doing something good. You'd be surprised the number of parents that ask me that I explain the concept of reinforcement. They say, oh, so you want me to trick him? Well, no, that's not really what we're doing either. It's not spoiling a child. It's not giving children unnecessary attention for things they should do by themselves. I get that question a lot as well. Well, he should be brushing his teeth by himself already, so why should I reinforce him for brushing his teeth? Well, right now he's not brushing his teeth. So when we start to reinforce it, then it's going to be more likely that he will continue to brush his teeth in the future. Reinforcement is not forever, as I said, and reinforcement is not expensive or time consuming. So the importance of reinforcement. Reinforcement, as we said before, is a way of teaching. I like to explain it to parents as reinforcement is payment, that we all go to work and we get paid. If you didn't get paid for going to work, would you continue going to work? Probably not, because you wouldn't be getting your half of the deal, essentially. You wouldn't be getting what you go to work for. So we need to think, when we're talking about kids with autism, we need to think of the tasks that we're requiring them to do as work. When we're asking them to put their shoes on, that's work for them. When we're asking them to sit down and talk to us, that's work for them. So when we set up ahead of time, if you sit down and work with me, then you will earn time on your DS. Then we're letting them know what their payment is going to be for sitting and engaging in that work task. I think it's also important to remember that our kids with autism are typically working harder than other kids. Tasks are harder for them to do. So whereas other kids, it may be very easy for them to go and put their shoes on, for kids with autism, they may have sensory difficulties, which make it more difficult for them. They may have finer gross motor delays, which make it more difficult for them. So it's not as easy as just going and putting your shoes on. So when we're thinking about why we need to reinforce, we need to realize these daily tasks are much more difficult for them to engage in. Kids with autism often have difficulty contacting natural reinforcers in the environment as well, which is kind of why we need to increase our external reinforcement, or the reinforcement that we have in place for them, to make sure that they are getting reinforced. So an example would be a child who is developmentally typical may walk over to another child and start an interaction, and that child is reinforcing to them. They enjoy interacting with them. The child responds appropriately. They have a very nice and appropriate interaction with them. A kid with autism may walk up to another child and either not start the interaction appropriately, so then they aren't reinforced by engaging with the other child, or the other child doesn't respond appropriately to them and just runs away, so they don't contact that reinforcement. Or it could be that interacting with other kids just isn't meaningful and reinforcing for them at all anyway. So we need to have other reinforcement in place to make sure that we're increasing those positive behaviors. Does that make sense? Awesome. And then again, those natural reinforcers just might not be meaningful. They may have difficulty contacting the reinforcer in the natural environment. So the importance of meaningful reinforcers. I think sometimes both professionals and parents can kind of get hung up on the difference between what is a preference and what is reinforcement. So when we talk about preference, preference is something that you like. So if I asked you, would you rather dry your hands with these cruddy brown paper towels, or would you rather dry your hands with these nice soft white paper towels? You'd probably tell me I really prefer the white paper towels. They do a better job of, cleaning my hands. They do a better job of drying them off. My hands feel better afterwards. If I ask you though, how much work would you do for a white paper towel? You'd probably be like, I'm not going to do any work for a white paper towel. I'll just wipe my hands on my pants. So that's what we're looking at. That's the difference between what is a preference and what is reinforcing. What is a reinforcer? A reinforcer is something that you will do work for. And when we talk about how reinforcing is an item for a child, what we're looking at is how much work will they do for that item. So in order to increase the value of something, to make it more reinforcing or more valuable for them, we need obviously to have something that is preferred. We need to have something that is relatively meaningful for this situation. So if we have something that's completely out of context, then it's just not going to be meaningful for the child. It needs to be something that fits with the amount of work that we required them to do. Like I said before, I had that little guy that would work for just a quarter of an olive. But if I asked him to do, 20 minutes of homework when really his ability level was at, let's touch our nose, let's tap our hands, let's knock on the table. If I asked him then, well, sit down and do 20 minutes of homework and then I'll give you a quarter of an olive, he would have been like, there's no way. So quarter of an olive fits for when I say, touch your nose, clap your hands, great job, you can have your reinforcer. It does not work for those longer tasks that are much more difficult. And that's true of kids that are on the higher functioning end of the spectrum as well, that we need to look at, well, for 5 minutes of homework, what would be a meaningful reinforcer and what would be appropriate for that time? Whereas an hour of homework, we're going to be looking at something much different.
Before you get the person the child to perform a task or do work, do you show them the reinforcer first?
Absolutely.
Like, this is what you're going to get if you do this amount of work.
Absolutely, definitely. And that makes it so much more meaningful if they know what it is that they're going to be working for.
Right.
If you think like you're going into a job and you're not sure how much you're going to get paid, you say, well, I could get a quarter of an olive, or I could get a whole bag of chips, or I could get to go to Chuck E. Cheese. How much work am I going to put in? If I'm only getting a quarter of an olive, I'm really not going to put a whole lot of work into this. So letting the child know ahead of time what they're going to be getting is going to be so much more helpful.
I was just trying to figure out why wouldn't that be bribery? Like, where you show them first, here you go, this is what you got if you do this.
So remember, bribery would be if you introduced it after the child had started engaging in problem behavior. So if you said, hey, come on, we're going to work, and they fell on the floor, and you said you need to come sit in your seat, and they started kicking and screaming. If then you came over and you said, but you can have chips, you can have chips, you can have chips, then that's a big problem, because then you're bribing them, and you're also kind of reinforcing the negative behavior. Whereas if you say, you need to come work, sit at the table, and you can have chips, and the child walks over and sits down at the table, then you can absolutely reinforce that behavior.
So kicking them out of the negative behavior, is that another class or something? All right.
Maybe next time.
All right.
This is much more focused on the positive side of things. But, I mean, it's important in kind of the antecedent side, and how do we manage so we don't have those problem behaviors come up, is having all this positive reinforcement in place for them. Good question. Also, in terms of making sure that the item is reinforcing and stays reinforcing for the child, you want to have restricted access at other times. So I talk to parents a lot about this when we're working on potty training, that they say, well, he loves his Thomas movies, and he sits and he watches Thomas all the time. I say, great, let's use Thomas movies for going to the bathroom. And they say, okay, but right now he watches that all the time. If the child were then to earn Thomas movies for going potty, that wouldn't make much of a difference to him, because he got to watch it at all the other times too, so he's not going to be motivated to work towards earning it. Whereas if we restrict access to Thomas movies at all other times, and just as you said, we make sure that he knows that that's the contingency. We know if you go pee-pee in the potty, then you can earn your Thomas movies. Then it's going to be that much more meaningful because he didn't have access to it during all those other times. At least at first, and particularly for kids who are more early learners, the reinforcer should be something that's easily and quickly accessible. So that's why edibles are typically used at first, because they are immediately reinforcing. They can be given right away, and the child is then going to be much more likely to be quickly reinforced by something that's edible. It could be something that's sensory, or something that is a toy that is very reinforcing as well. But it shouldn't be something like, hey, touch your nose, clap your hands, knock on the table. All right, great job. Now you can have your Thomas. Let me find it. I don't know where it went. Let me go plug it in. Let's wait for the movie to boot up. That's not going to be reinforcing. The kid's going to be like, what happened here? I thought I was getting Thomas, and now there's nothing. And then you're probably going to see problem behavior. So making sure that if he's working for Thomas, then you have it all queued up, it's sitting on the table, it's ready to go, and you just push the button and you can automatically see Thomas come on and start singing and doing whatever. So meaningful verbal praise. I talk to parents a lot about what is going to be meaningful for the child in terms of verbal praise and how we can increase the likelihood that we're reinforcing the appropriate behavior. Some kids are very motivated by verbal praise, other kids not so much. But regardless, when you are praising a child verbally or using verbal reinforcement, you want to make sure that you're keeping it specific and that it's timely. So if a child touches his nose, it sounds very repetitive at first. I say, touch your nose. The kid touches his nose. I say, great job touching your nose. Nice work. So that I am clearly reinforcing exactly the behavior that he did. I also do it immediately afterwards. So he does the behavior, you reinforce immediately right away so that you make sure that you aren't accidentally reinforcing any other behavior that might happen in between. Verbal praise should be very frequent. It should be excited and animated. You also want to make it positive and keep it positive. I have, and this is where this comic came in. I thought it was pretty funny that I found this one. Because I had a mother that I worked with for a period of time that we were working a lot on verbal praise. How do you praise your daughter? How can you say things that are going to increase the likelihood that she will repeat these positive behaviors? So mom comes in and she says, Dr. Loy, this isn't working. You're not giving me good suggestions. This is not working. I'm praising her all the time. I'm telling her she's doing a good job. I say, tell me exactly what you're saying. And she says to me, well, I said, thank you for not throwing tantrums. I love it when it's so nice and quiet and I don't have to hear you screaming all the time. Well, that's not exactly what I was going for when I said make it specific. Yes, that is specific, but let's keep it on the positive side. Let's say something like, great job staying so nice and quiet, and leave it at that. Let's not kind of go down that road where it turns into, I don't know, a backhanded compliment or something. I don't even know what's going on with that one. The other aspect of this is that it has to be what a child enjoys. So some kids really love that high quality, really excited, really animated praise and excitement. So for a lot of kids, I do a lot of that they put the block in the bucket. Great job putting the block in the bucket. And I'm tickling and I'm giving high fives and they're super excited. I hate when I start to do that with a kid and then I realize this is not what they like at all. And you can tell right away because they'll put the block in the bucket and I say, great job! And the kid will start to shrink down and like hide. And I feel terrible and I realize this is not reinforcing. I just scared him and he probably then will not do this behavior again. I have clearly punished this behavior and not reinforced it. So making sure that you stick with what it is that a child is going to like. So maybe that child still likes the verbal praise, but they like it nice and quiet. They like still the surprised face. Oh my goodness, you touched your nose. You put the block in the bucket. Good working. And they like that kind of more restrained type of praise rather than the over-the-top, really excited type of praise. Does that make sense? Any on the spectrum that say, but you don't understand. My kid is only interested in one thing. And more often than not, that thing is Thomas, or trains, or vehicles, or something like that. My kid only likes one thing. So if we're talking about Thomas, there are so many different ways we can reinforce a child with his interest in Thomas the Tank Engine. That we can have tracks, and he's earning pieces of track. He could be earning trains, he could be earning Thomas stickers, he could be earning Thomas movies, Legos, stamps, coloring pages, books, fruit snacks, any number of things. It's also important to remember that if we're talking about something like movies, which a lot of our kids are reinforced by electronics or movies or things like that, it doesn't need to be he touches his nose, puts the block in the bucket, and then gets to sit and watch an entire Thomas episode. Maybe he then gets to sit and he gets 15 seconds of a Thomas episode. It is amazing to me what some of our kids will work for. You know, from the quarter of the olive, I had some kids that I cut Skittles into 4 pieces, and they were earning a quarter of a Skittle, and they would work for that quarter of a Skittle. So they will earn 15 seconds, 30 seconds of watching Thomas and then be redirected back to work, and that is still reinforcing for them. Yes.
What if you have parents say that their child is only reinforced by food, so it's not in the natural environment when they start going to interact with other peers, and that's not reinforcing to them? So they're always been stuck with working with food.
Can you say your question?
So like what do you say to
Where would
parents
you go?
if their only interest is food and it's not an object or?
Right. I think starting with food is an okay thing, and you obviously want to try to get away from that as kids get older. But I think making sure that parents are prepared in situations, particularly like you said, in social situations, then maybe they make the contingency, hey, go talk to one friend and then you can earn 3 Skittles. So having the parents have that reinforcer available so that they can reinforce immediately afterwards, but it takes a little bit more planning on the parents' part. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right, so I'll explain, you know, there's so many different ways you can reinforce even in this one interest, and parents will say, no, but seriously, you're not getting me here. There is absolutely nothing that he likes that he's interested in. Maybe it's only food. He will only work for chips, that's it. I can't get him interested in anything else. So I think one of the most wonderful things about kids with autism, aside from the fact that they're always unique, totally interesting, and sometimes mysterious, is their idiosyncratic interests. And this is kind of a list of some of the interests that I've worked with kids that I've had be their reinforcer. I've got a little kid I work with right now, and his big interest is fire alarms. And he wants to talk about fire alarms and what type of fire alarm we have, and the last time my building had a fire drill, and what the fire alarm sounds like, and if it's one that just makes noise, or does it actually say something, and where you have to go outside when you have a fire drill. So he will sit and he will talk nicely with me, and he will do work essentially for 20 minutes in order to earn a couple minutes of time to talk about fire alarms and talk about fire drills. So you can use these interests to your advantage. Repetitive questions is another one that kids like to ask, kind of these perseverative questions over and over and over and over and over again. And I make what's called question time, that they sit and they work with me for a period of time, and then we'll have question time where then they can ask me anything that they want to ask me about, whether that's fire alarms or whatever their special interest might be. Heating and air conditioning noises has been another big one I've seen recently. And they get to talk to me about these really cool heating and air conditioning noises, or ask me questions about what sort of sound my air conditioning unit makes in homes. Presidents, lights, fans, anything that the child has decided is their interest, we can use to our advantage. Stereotypic behaviors are another one. There was an interesting study done not that long ago about how kids on the spectrum will be reinforced by engaging in their stereotypic behaviors. So things like hand flapping or string play or, I don't know, running out of examples. Chew tubes, any of those types of things. Exactly. And it is okay for the child to engage in self-stimulatory stereotypic behaviors during their break times. If that's really all that they're interested in doing, if they will sit and work for you and then be able to sit and rock, that is absolutely okay. We can allow them to work to be able to take a break then and sit and rock or flap their hands or whatever it may be that they're interested in working for. I had a child that I worked for whose big reinforcer was Mardi Gras beads, that he liked to dangle them and he liked to swing them around and he liked to put them on the floor and hear them against the wall. So I did a preference assessment of which string of Mardi Gras beads do you like the best? Do you like the ones with the bigger beads or the smaller beads or the purple ones or the green ones? And he loved the purple ones with the small beads. So I worked with him for 4 hours a week for about 6 months. And he worked for those purple beads for 4 hours a week. And he loved them. So if the only thing a child will work for is a string of beads, find him his favorite string of beads. Like I said before, working from time to talk about special interests, working time to ask questions about interests. And then you only want to, again, what I was saying before about restricting access to reinforcers during other times, make sure that you're not talking about his restricted interests during other times. You're not talking about fire alarms throughout the day. You're not answering questions about fire alarms throughout the day. Only during times when he has earned it, when he's earned question time or fire alarm time or whatever you decide to call it, only during that time are you engaging that restricted interest. Does this all make sense? Yeah? So what to reinforce? This is just a very short list of the behaviors that we can reinforce. I mean, we are talking about anything from work tasks to the absence of problem behavior. So if you have a child who has really frequent self-injurious behavior, then maybe you're providing attention and giving really high quality praise, providing his favorite string of beads during times when he is not engaging in self-injurious behavior. That's reinforcing. Maybe you're reinforcing chores, following directions, keeping hands to self, homework, going potty, any number of things for kids all along the spectrum of early learners to much more high-functioning kids. We all are working with reinforcement and trying to find what's meaningful and reinforcing. When to reinforce? Obviously, you want to reinforce as soon as possible, and particularly for early learners, reinforcement should occur immediately after the target behavior. And you don't want other behaviors to occur between the target behavior and the reinforcement. All right, I'm going to skip to this slide and talk about this one. I'll go back to the previous one. When we talk about accidental reinforcement, which is kind of when you accidentally reinforce a behavior that you didn't need to reinforce. So then we're talking about shaping up a behavior that we didn't want to increase the frequency of. So these would be a couple examples. Every time Sarah has a tantrum at school, she is removed from the classroom and taken to the sensory room. I see this a lot at schools, and I talked to a little guy who's, I think, 9 the other day, and I asked him what his favorite thing to do was, and he told me his favorite thing is going to the sensory OT room at school. I asked him when he goes to the sensory OT room, and he tells me, well, when I have a tantrum or when I bite my teacher. So we are accidentally increasing the likelihood that he's going to have a tantrum and that he's going to bite his teacher because he loves going to that sensory room, chilling out, having fun, playing on the slide or the balls or whatever it is that's in there that he really loves. Every time Marcus wants attention, he hits his mother. So his mother turns to him and says, Marcus, no hitting, hitting hurts. We're then accidentally increasing the likelihood that he's going to continue hitting his mother because what he's looking for is attention. So mom is giving him exactly what he wants, even though it's kind of a negative statement that she's saying to him. Emily hits her father, puts in the final puzzle piece, and then dumps the crayons on the floor. Emily's father excitedly says, nice work, because she put in the puzzle piece, and gives Emily her reinforcer. Well, that's a problem because Emily then isn't sure what exactly Dad was saying nice work to, and she may be more likely to put in that last puzzle piece, but she may be just as likely to hit her father and dump the crayons on the floor because we've just reinforced that whole string of behaviors. Does that make sense? This one is a little bit tricky. Sam cries each time his mother leaves the house, and he continues to cry until his mother comes home. So what we're talking about here would be superstitious reinforcement. The kid then makes the association of I cried, I continued crying, and then mom came back. So we have accidentally reinforced Sam's crying by the fact that mom then came home while he was still crying. He may then be more likely in the future to continue crying until mom comes home, because he knows if I cry for long enough, mom's gonna come back. I just know it. It happened last time and the time before that, so I'll just keep crying, and I know mom's gonna walk through that door. Does that make sense? I'll go back to this slide. So shaping is when we reinforce successive approximations towards the ultimate behavior that we want the child to engage in. So if we want the child to, I'll just take this picture for an example, to learn to eat with a spoon, then first we're just going to reinforce holding the spoon. You're holding the spoon? Great job, thank you for holding the spoon. You're doing such nice work. I love the way you're sitting with me at the table and holding the spoon. Then we're going to reinforce putting the spoon into the food, putting food onto the spoon, lifting the spoon up with the food on it, and finally bringing the spoon to his mouth. If we were only to wait until the child was able to do that, then he might not ever be able to do it. We need to reinforce those approximations towards the ultimate goal along the way. There's also the idea of backwards chaining, where, like with eating would be a perfect example. First, all he has to do is that last step of putting the spoon with the food on it into his mouth, and then we go backwards from there. So then he has to hold the spoon with the food on it and then bring it to his mouth. Then we need to just have him bring it up to his mouth, and finally we're all the way back to the beginning where we're reinforcing that first step. Tying shoes is another good example of backwards chaining, that you do the entire thing and all the child has to do is pull the loop through at the end, and you reinforce that, hooray, nice job, you did the last step of tying your shoes. And then you continue going backwards from there, reinforcing the steps in a backwards motion. That can sometimes be a little bit more reinforcing because the child then sees, I did the last step, so I completed it. So hooray for me, I tied my shoes, or I got the immediate reinforcement of putting that food in my mouth. Does that make sense? Changing up the reinforcer, this is an important aspect of this. That a child will likely at some point satiate on the reinforcer, which means that the reinforcer is no longer reinforcing. It just isn't meaningful to him. I mean, same with us. We know that we may really love some specific dessert, but if we ate it every single day, it's not going to be special anymore, and it's not going to mean as much to us. So reinforcer potency should be assessed frequently. A lot of times I'll have parents that come to me after we talk about reinforcers and they say, oh my gosh, he's now getting ready in the morning all by himself. He is so motivated. This is wonderful. This Thomas video really did it. This is perfect. And then 2 weeks later they come back in and they say, yeah, it was no good. It doesn't work anymore. Well, the concept still works. It's just that that Thomas video isn't reinforcing for him anymore, and we need to find something else. It's important to remember, too, that preferences change over time. It may depend on the day. So some days, I'm really motivated to earn some chips. Other days, I really just don't feel like eating chips. And that's okay. I'm motivated to work towards earning something else. It depends on the task, and it also depends on the time. If I went to get ice cream with Dad before coming to session to see Dr. Laura, then I'm probably not motivated to earn M&Ms because I just had ice cream, which is so much better than M&Ms. So I'm going to have to work to find something different that will be more reinforcing. Schedules of reinforcement. I changed this slide just a little bit last night when I was looking at this and added a little bit more information. So it's different than what you guys see in your handouts there. So there's different ways that we can reinforce. The first thing that we look at in terms of a schedule of reinforcement is an interval schedule. And that's based on the amount of time that has passed between when the child engages in the appropriate behavior or the behavior that you want to reinforce. So for example, a fixed interval, a child would receive a Skittle for every 30 seconds for staying in her seat. So every 30 seconds, you are giving her a Skittle based on the amount of time. Doesn't matter what behaviors are happening then, she's staying in her seat, we're giving her that Skittle. That would be a fixed interval because it's staying with the same amount of time every single time we're reinforcing. The other interval schedule that we can look at would be a variable interval. So the example here would be a child is praised every 5 to 10 minutes for working on her art project. So as long as she's continuing to sit, maybe in 5 minutes, we give her some verbal praise and we say, great job continuing to color. And then 7 minutes later, we say, hey, I love the way you're continuing to work on that art project. But it's a variable amount of time. We aren't sticking with the same amount of time each time we're praising or giving that reinforcement. So then there's also the option, of reinforcing on a ratio schedule, which is based on the number of responses. So a fixed ratio would be when a child receives verbal praise after every 3 math problems. So he does 1, 2, 3, great job, here's a Skittle, continue working on your math problems. He does 3 more, we give him another Skittle for continuing to work. A variable ratio would be when a child gets an M&M after between 1 and 5 word approximations. So I say something like, say and the child says I say great job, say say it again, say they say I say awesome job, say awesome job, and then I give the reinforcer. Then we do another trial, I say she says and I give her a reinforcer. We do it again, and I have her do 7 times before I issue that reinforcer. Does that make sense? I think I'm going to touch on this in just a minute, but when we're looking at kind of what's most preferred, the variable ratio schedule is the one that's going to be most resistant to extinction. And by that, what I mean is that that's going to be the one that stays true the longest. That's going to be the one that is going to be most resistant to suddenly burning or fizzling out. And if you think about like playing the lottery or slot machines, that's on a variable ratio schedule. That sometimes you put your coin in and you get a whole lot of money back. Sometimes you put it in, you don't get anything, so you put another one in, you put another one in, because you never know when you're going to get that money. Does that make sense? So you kind of want to stick with that variable ratio schedule. Most ideal. Schedules of reinforcement. So initially, you want to work with what's called a very thick or dense schedule of reinforcement and gradually thin the schedule over time. So initially, you may be wanting to reinforce every single correct response. Every single time they do what you're asking them to do, you're reinforcing. That would be a very thick schedule. As then the desired response is learned, you're going to start fading that reinforcement back, so you're not reinforcing them as frequently. So I talked before about the differences between preferences and reinforcements. I'm going to talk just a little bit about what preference assessments are and how you can kind of go through a preference assessment with a child. But before I do that, I want to stop and ask if there are any questions about reinforcement schedules, any of that, because I know that was a lot of information. We're kind of switching gears just slightly. Nothing? Awesome. Okay. So preference assessments, again, are just looking at preference. We aren't looking at how much is this going to reinforce the child or how much work are they going to be willing to do. We're just looking at what do they like the most, which is really important information to have because it's not always going to be what you expect. So single stimulus preference assessments are just when you give a child one item at a time and you see how long they will engage with that item. So this is generally better for kids that are going to have difficulty choosing, for kids that are more early learners, because they may have, with the other options for preference assessments, you may not be able to get a clean picture of what it really is that they want or what they're really showing you that they're more interested by due to their difficulty in choosing. So with this, a single stimulus, you just present the item, give it to the child, let them play with it. If they play with it for 20 seconds and then drop it, you know it's probably not a very preferred item. Whereas if they continue playing with it, they continue to be engaged by it, that's likely going to be an item that is more high preference. Forced choice preference assessments tend to be what most people go to in doing preference assessments. And that's where you present 2 items at a time, and you say, you can play with Thomas or you can play with trains, choose one. And the child will then make a choice and get to play with that item for a short period of time. And then you can rank items in terms of their level of preference. Is it a low preferred item that they chose it sometimes but not others? And you can get a really nice hierarchy of what it is the child likes to do. And then a multiple stimulus preference assessment is when you present 3 or more items at a time, and you say, out of all of these items, pick the one that you like the most. And the child then picks the one that is most reinforcing. And then you take the items that are left and you say, hey, out of these, which one would you like the most? And they pick that one. So then you're left with the items that are the least reinforcing by the end. This is much faster, but it also requires a higher level of learning for them to be able to make that choice from the number of items that are presented. So reinforcement hierarchies or preference hierarchies, you can just then look from your preference assessment, what is most preferred by this child? What are the things that they like the most? So maybe M&Ms they chose consistently all the time above everything else. Then you know M&Ms are the most preferred, whereas popcorn they chose maybe not at all, or they chose 1 or 2 times. So you know it's not really preferred. I think it gets interesting when you get into something that you may not really expect. So you may have a child who is most reinforced by 10 minutes of time to play on the Wii, and they're more reinforced by that than an hour of computer time, which we may not expect. We may think, well, an hour of computer time is clearly better than just 10 minutes on the Wii. But the kid's like, no, that Wii is so much fun that it's better than an hour on the computer or a 30-minute TV show or anything. So we can't always assume that what we think is the better option is going to be what's most reinforcing for the child. So this would be an example of how you might take a reinforcement hierarchy or take that ranked list of preferences and use it in something like a behavior chart. That the child is on green, they get all sorts of attention, all their favorite toys and TV, they get some sort of special treat that you've identified as their highest reinforcer. If they lose some privileges, they're on yellow, they don't get the special treat, they only have access to TV and some toys, but they don't have cars because you know the cars are the most reinforcing for them. And they get attention only when following directions. So you're able to kind of draw from those different points of that hierarchy and say, well, the most reinforcing things are this, so that's what we'll take away. And when they're down at the bottom, when they've lost all of their privileges, then these are all the things that are meaningful that we can take away. I included this as an example. This is based off a chart that I made for a young man that I worked with who had some very specific interests. Red, yellow, and green didn't mean anything to him. His favorite colors and his favorite numbers were much more meaningful. So when I told him, hey, great job staying on green, he's like, I hate green, I don't want to stay on green, so why am I going to work to be good to stay on green? Instead, his favorite colors were black and purple, and his favorite numbers were 52, 50, and 53 after his favorite bus routes. So we made that his highest preferred level, and those were the things that he was more motivated by. He was also extremely motivated by his bus schedules. He just liked to carry probably 15 bus schedules around with him. He loved watching Wizards of Waverly Place, and he loved attention from Mom. So then when he lost some privileges and he was on that lower level of reinforcement, he could only have 2 bus schedules with him. He could not carry all of his 15 bus schedules around with him. He did not get to watch Wizards of Waverly Place. And then he really didn't get much attention from Mom except for when he was following directions. Does that make sense? How you can kind of translate those preferences and reinforcing items and use them, including kind of those idiosyncratic interests, and use them in a situation like this? Awesome. Primary versus secondary reinforcement. Primary reinforcers, things like food, toys, are inherently meaningful and reinforcing. Secondary reinforcers are only reinforcing because of what they mean or because of their potential for reinforcement. So something like tokens or money, where the kid then has to cash them in order to get that more reinforcing thing that they want. So this is just an example of a very simple token chart that maybe they get 3 smiley faces and then they get to play with dinosaurs. Those smiley faces don't really mean anything by themselves, but they carry the potential for reinforcement, the potential to be able to play with dinosaurs down the road. Another example of a token board, working towards earning time to watch Blue's Clues, and we had several different characters from Blue's Clues' tokens. Fading reinforcement. So reinforcement should be faded over time and should be faded slowly. If you decide, oh, this behavior's been learned, I no longer need to reinforce it, so you stop reinforcing altogether, the kid's going to be like, hey, then I'm not going to keep cleaning my room, or I'm not going to keep touching my nose when you ask me to because I no longer get what I'm supposed to get out of it. Whereas if you slowly fade out the reinforcement, the child's more likely to continue the behavior. If you, again, the variable ratio schedule, so when you're doing things on a inconsistent, so a variable amount of responses, then that would be a variable ratio schedule. Fading the reinforcement should be based on data and not on the time frame. So parents will say, well, I've been reinforcing him tying his shoes for the past 6 months. I'm done with it, he's learned it, we should be over that by now. But that's not necessarily true. If he still doesn't really have it, then you should continue reinforcing it. So you need to continue looking at what's the data, how often is he tying his shoes, do I need to continue reinforcing it, rather than saying, I've been reinforcing this long enough, you know, we're moving on. Yes.
Do you have a rule of thumb of how frequently it's starting to be consistent before you decide it's okay to start to fade?
I wish there was. That would make it so much easier. I really feel like it depends on the child, though. It depends on the consistency and depends on what the behavior is. All those different variables really play such a big role in that. It would be so much easier if I could, tell parents, hey, what you need to do is just wait until it's happening this frequently and then you can fade out. But it really depends on the child. So you're going to decrease the intensity of the reinforcement as well as the timing and the frequency of the reinforcement. By decreasing the intensity too, what I mean is maybe they were getting their highest preferred item. Maybe they were getting that piece of olive every single time they did something, and then you start to scale that back a little bit. So they're getting something that's a little bit less preferred, but they're still getting reinforced for it. That way you're not going from 100 if I get my very favorite thing ever to I'm not getting anything at all, and then you're going to accidentally probably